Now then, how do? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be making this English oak and black American walnut sideboard. Stick around and watch the video if you want to see how it's made in its entirety. But in addition to this, I'm going to be making some shorter videos that go into more detail on things like how I made the legs, the frame and panel doors, how I made the handles and stuff like that. So if you like what you see, keep watching and enjoy. As always, I start by milling the rough sawn timber, and in this case I'm using Waney Edge oak and rough sawn black American walnut. So it had to go across the bandsaw before I could put it across the planer thicknesser. And after milling, I wanted to prepare the edges properly for joining, so here I'm planing a spring joint into the boards. And this is done with a combination of a number 7, a number 5 and a number 4 smoothing plane. And the idea is that you plane it completely flat first and then plane a gradually tapered hollow into the middle of the boards, and this ensures that when you clamp it up there is a nice firm glue joint all the way along the board, but it's tighter at the ends where it's more likely to separate with age. And after doing that, I simply spread the glue on each edge and then put it in the clamps to dry up. And whilst I'm waiting for the glue to dry on that set of boards, I start marking out a template for the legs. Now this template isn't going to be like a routing template, although you could probably use it for that. But the legs are going to be shaped on each of the 4 sides, so routing is pretty much out of the question, and it's going to have to be done on the bandsaw. So to make the template, I draw it out on some 9mm ply, cut it out on the bandsaw, and then smooth it with planes and sandpaper. So while this is going on, I might as well talk about the wood that I'm using. So I've bought 2.5 cubic feet of English oak in close to 1 inch thickness, a cubic foot of black American walnut in I think 60 or 65mm thickness, and a cubic foot of European beech for the draw sides. And this all came in at somewhere in the region of about £350. After cutting out the template, I need to start working on the legs. Now, I'd already planed and cut these to rough length, so the first thing to do is to cut the mortices, because if you try and cut the mortices in a shaped leg, you're going to really struggle to hold it still. So cut the mortices whilst it's still square, and then after that you can then shape the legs, knowing that your mortices will always stay square. And I've been using this Charnwood hollow chisel mortiser for a while now, and I have to say it is absolutely fantastic. It is a really good machine for what it is. It saves a lot of time and it's incredibly accurate when used properly. After cutting the mortices, this is a day or so later now, I can take the first panel out of the clamps, and because I took my time ensuring that when I glued them up they were level with each other, there isn't much work to do. So I use a cabinet scraper, a hand plane and a card scraper just to take a few light passes off each side, and that fully flattens it out. And now on to cutting the straight tapers on the legs using a tapering jig on the table saw. As I've said in previous videos, I don't like using the table saw without the crown guard, but sometimes it's still the best tool for the job, even taking the risk of not using the crown guard. These legs are going to have 2 straight tapers each on adjacent sides of a corner, and then the other 2 sides are going to be shaped in a modern cabriole style. So obviously I've used the template to draw out on these blocks of wood the shape of the legs. The first step was to cut the straight tapers, and then I taped those straight tapers back onto the original block, and now I'm cutting out the shapes. Any small offcuts like down at the feet, I just get rid of them, But then the big offcuts, which you can see being cut here, they're kept and taped back on so that when I pass it back through the bandsaw, I can keep it square as possible. Obviously the bandsaw is only there for roughing out the shape, and the legs are refined properly using a combination of hand planes, chisels, rasps, sanding blocks, anything that I can use to incrementally improve the shape. Moving on from the legs, I've now got all the panels glued up and I'm starting to mark out the dovetails. On the two top corners of the cabinet, they're going to have lapped and mitred dovetails. The bottom corners of the cabinet are just going to be through dovetails, but the look of them from the side will be exactly the same as the ones at the top. And I don't really do much measuring when it comes to dovetails. I've marked out the centre of the board, and then I've marked out the centre of each of those two sections, and I think I did the centre of those sections again. There's something like 5 sets of double pins that I'm marking out here. And I'm cutting the pins first because with this joint it's really hard to cut the tails first and mark out properly from there. It's much easier and more straightforward to do the pins, and also doing the pins first has another advantage, and that is that you can have whatever pattern of dovetails you like, and it's much easier to lay out without having to think too much about it. So after marking the pencil lines, I obviously scribe the shoulder lines and then draw the vertical 90-degree lines down to the shoulder line. But I only do this on one side because obviously, like I said, these are going to be mitred. And then it's on to cutting them out using a fine-tooth dovetail saw. Now these saws cut really slowly, but they have the advantage that it's much easier to stay accurate. And you'll see what I mean in a minute with regards to the lapped mitred dovetails. Obviously I'm coping out the waste here, and I'm trying to go down one of the dovetail saw curves and then turn and come along. Occasionally the coping saw binds because actually you should be using a fret saw for this, but I don't have a fret saw. So here you can see the miters between the pins, and these are further refined by using a paring block. And when I start using the paring block, I use the mallet and chisel to get rid of any large amounts of waste. And once the large amount of waste is gone and I can go into my shoulder line, I then pare by hand. This is a time-consuming process, but I find it very therapeutic. It's quite relaxing and I can easily spend all day doing this. When you're paring like this, it's best not to take a full chisel width, but rather just come across a couple of millimetres and take a few mils at a time with each pass. It shaves off so much easier than just jamming a full width of a chisel in there. Now it's on to marking out the tails, and I do this with the dovetail marking board that I made. It's covered in a previous video. I'll put a card up in the top corner now so you can go and watch that video if you want. And once I've marked out, it's on to cutting the tails. With the tails I remove the waste with the coping saw again, and then it's just chiselling back to my line. So whilst we're watching this, let me talk a bit more about the wood. The English oak that I'm using has a really coarse grain pattern to it, and there's a lot of knots in it and pips and stuff like that. And I wanted to keep all those defects in the finished piece because it adds a lot of character to it, especially when you combine it with something like a walnut base like I'm doing, where the walnut is super clean, and a really sort of high-end furniture grade wood. Having the contrast of that with the rough looking oak but really quite fine joinery, it's a look that not many people go for, but I really appreciate it. I think it looks lovely like that. So now I'm simply paring off all the tails at 45 degrees. I made the rough cut at the table saw because all my hand saws have a spine on them, so I can't cut deep enough with them. So I did the rough miter cut on the table saw and now paring by hand. And here I'm test fitting the joint for the first time. These dovetails are all quite tight, and cutting them across such a wide board, it can make getting the panel together quite difficult. But as you can see, they seat all right, although they're not fully seated here. I don't want to hammer them completely home. But the dovetails seat okay, and the angles on the miters match. So when I actually put it together, they should be absolutely fine. And here I'm marking out my large chamfer that's going to be on the front of the cabinet. This is the most accurate way to do it, I find, and that is just to scribe 2 pencil lines and then plane until you meet both at the same time. And this gives a really nice sort of fine furniture detail on the front of the cabinet. It might not look like much at the minute, but when you see it on the finished cabinet, it really adds a nice touch to it. And obviously just use whatever planes work best at any given time. So block planes, low angle jacks, smoothers, number 5, whatever. It doesn't really matter. What you want is a nice quality finish. After that, I route the grooves for the captive back panel, and then following that, I route the housing joints for the dividers. This is a cheap Toolstation Silverline Special router. It cost about £30 about 8 years ago, and yes, it's cheap and nasty, but it has never ever missed a beat. It has just kept going. I'm amazed by it. And as I said, here I'm routing the housing joints for the dividers, and I square those up with a chisel. After all the routing's done, I use a template to drill holes in the dividers for the shelves that will go in later. And once that's done, I pre-finish the cabinet. I apply a coat or 2 of lemon shellac so that I don't have to do it once it's assembled. This just saves time and effort. So yesterday I glued up the carcass of the cabinet, and because of the heat I ran into some problems. This end glued up fine. This end there's some gaps that I need to close because the glue effectively dried before I could get the joint closed, which is an absolute pain. Also glued in one of the dividers the wrong way around and upside down, so I've had to make some corrections there. However, let's crack on and see what we can do to fix this. After taking the carcass out of the clamps, the first thing that I did was take a hand plane to it. And the reason for this is I'm trying to level the joints off so that the corners, the very sort of edge corners of the miters, so that they meet in both planes. And actually what I found is once I'd done that, the joints looked absolutely fine. They weren't as open as I thought. It was just the very tips of them, they maybe sort of bent round during the glue up. But with a hand plane and a card scraper, they came out absolutely fine. The joints on the bottom left corner though, as you're looking at it now, the through dovetails, they're seated perfectly well on the left edge, but when you look from underneath, they didn't seat properly there, and they're the joints I had to fill. But that doesn't matter because you will never see them. Now that the carcass is done, it's on to start making the doors. So here I'm planing down the stock that's going to be used for the rails and stiles of the doors. Next I'm just shooting the ends of these just so that when I do make the cuts I've got a nice square board all around. And I'm using a low angle jack here, the Luban number 62. And it is an excellent plane for shooting, it does the job beautifully, but it's not a shooting plane in terms of how you hold it. A proper shooting plane has handles and stuff like that, whereas shooting with this for prolonged periods, it can make your hands quite sore. I've had a few blisters in the past from it. And we've skipped ahead here a bit. So I've now cut those planed timbers down to final length and I've started cutting the tenons. And I'm using a rip cut carcass saw here. It makes quick and accurate work of it. And actually these Veritas carcass saws, I've even used them to dovetail before and they're brilliant for it. They are a rough cut, but by the time you get the dovetails together you just can't tell, and it makes quick and precise work of the job. Once I've cut the mortice and tenons and the grooves for the frame and panel doors, I move on to marking out the tenons for the leg base, and I take the measurement straight off the top of the legs here because I want the members to sit flush with the fronts and the sides of each leg. And to cut these out, to make sure that they're really precise, I do them on the table saw. So the first cut is just a nibble on the end to check the depth, and then using a stop block for the shoulder line, I just simply take chips away with each pass. This gives a really good, accurate and relatively quick way of cutting tenons. And then to refine them so that they fit perfectly, there's just no beating a router plane. Lots of people use shoulder planes and rebate block planes for this, and I've done it in the past. And it's fine on bigger stuff where you want a slightly looser tenon, but if you want a really nice tight fitting tenon on some really nice furniture, go with a router plane, you won't regret it. After cutting the tenons and refining them with the router plane and trimming off the shoulders and stuff like that, it's time for a test fit. And as you can see, this is quite tight, but it goes on just with hand pressure. I don't really need to use a mallet or anything to seat it. And once the glue's in there, despite what anyone else says, the glue will act as a lubricant. It always has done with me at least. So these will be absolutely fine. Now, going on to gluing up the frame and panel doors, I'm just gluing the tenons, and the panel just goes in without any glue whatsoever, and there's a little bit of room for it to expand and contract as required. So you might be able to see some gaps in the corners here. This is on the back of the door, and it's because I was making the maximum use of the amount of walnut that I had. That was a piece that had bored and I didn't have enough walnut to make new flat panels, so I simply reflattened the fronts and put them in with the curved backs, and they're absolutely fine. Then moving on to assembling the base, again I glued the mortice and tenons, and I'm using beech drawbar pegs here. And you can see at this point all the tenons have been cut off at 45 degrees, and that's because they meet inside the leg. And once they're drawboard together, they're absolutely solid. Now, not everything was as flush as I wanted, so I'm sanding and planing everything down here. And you can see that I've added 2 cross members. These are simply dovetailed in. Next, moving on to the drawers. Now that the carcass is assembled, the doors are assembled and the base is assembled, these are all single kerf lapped dovetails, and I'm basically batch processing them here. And the wood that I'm using for the drawer sides and backs is beech, because it is both cheap and stable. So here I'm fitting the handles. These profiles were made on the router table just with a couple of different bits. And what I haven't shown here obviously is the assembly of the drawers and cutting the grooves, or mortices rather, in the front of the drawers. So now I'm just tidying up these handles with a chisel and a saw before gluing them in. So I'm sanding the carcass down, and I'm using 80 and 120 grit, but I'm not going above 120 because when I planed the carcass down there was some tear out, and in this wood it tears out quite badly. So I took a card scraper to it, and there's a few like gradual sort of hollows or divots in the wood, but those, along with a few other little tool marks, I kind of want to leave them in the piece because it just adds that handmade feel to it. I don't want it to be super smooth. And in the bottom right corner here you can see some chip out on the through dovetails. I'm not worried about that because that's never going to get seen, so I will sand it, and when it's finishing it'll just get filled with a little bit of sawdust and finish. And moving on to finishing, I'm again applying lemon shellac to this, and my finishing process is basically apply a few coats of lemon shellac, sand after the first one, and then not sand after the second and third. And if you apply a fourth, then maybe just a very light kiss with some 320 or 400 grit sandpaper after that, just to smooth it out. And then once all the shellac's dry, I wax it. I'm using 2 different waxes. One of them is the walnut coloured bry wax, and that helps to darken the lemon tint from the shellac on the walnut. And the other is the Liberon Black Bison Furniture Wax. This stuff is excellent and smells amazing, and it gives a really nice mix of sort of a glossy satin finish. Right, so that's the build done, and this took about 120 hours to make, which was a little bit longer than I thought actually. However, it mostly went smoothly, though there were a few instances where things went wrong. As an example, there's a little bit of wood here that chipped out. Now I glued it back in when I was making the drawers, and it looks fine. It just looks like a repair on an antique. And likewise back here, there's the same thing happened up here. Now that's because I'm working with very fine edges. When you get out towards these edges, they're really thin bits of wood, but I did want the sideboard to look old from new anyway, and I think this just adds to the character of it. Likewise, there's still tool marks in the surface up here that I've left in. I want it to look like an old piece of furniture, and I think I've achieved that very well. So let's take a look around it and see what features it has. So the first thing is the dovetails on the drawer sides are all single kerf tails. And these drawers simply run on runners inside the cabinet. On the front of the cabinet we've got this edge here, and then it's chamfered quite heavily, and that makes the mitre going down there. I think it just adds a nice little feature. And then from the edge of this chamfer there is a step back to the doors. Then from the doors there is a step back to the divider, and then from the divider there is a small step back to the drawers. Moving on to the base, these legs are, well, they're effectively my take on a modern cabriole leg. Well, there's quite a lot going on with these. They were shaped on all four sides. So there's a lot of three-dimensional work going on that takes quite a bit of thinking about. And these are mortised and tenoned, and the tenons are pinned with beech dowels. And as you can probably tell, the top is floating, and I achieved this simply by dovetailing some cross members in here, and then under here, I don't know if you can see, there's just some supports that come about 2/3 of the way forwards. Moving round to the top, I've left all the knots and pips in it because I wanted that as a feature, and I think it makes it look really quite unique. And then coming round to the side, if I just mind out of the way of the light, so here you can see the top edge along here is really nice and clean, but then on the sides you've got these pairs of dovetails, and these are lapped mitred dovetails. As you can see, they form a mitred joint here, and I just think they work beautifully for cabinet making. And that's the cabinet. If you like this video, or if you like the piece of furniture that I made, please subscribe to the channel and leave a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the video, because it really does help. As I said, there will be a series of shorter videos coming where I show in much more detail how I made things like the legs, the doors, the handles and stuff like that. So keep tuned, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.